A hush falls over the crowd. Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rock. I'm Reverend Ned Wight, the interim senior minister here at the congregation, serving with Reverend Jennifer Brower and the Reverend Dr. Natalie Fenimore. The first thing that might occur to you is that I am not Jennifer Brower and that the order of service that you picked up does not have Evel Knievel on the cover, but it has Joseph Priestley. And you might be scratching your head and thinking, this is a classic bait and switch, just like poor advertisers do. But we have a rationale for this, which is a pastoral rationale. Jennifer's father was admitted to the hospital earlier this week with a very up and down trajectory. His condition is stabilized yesterday, and he seems to be getting stronger so that it's likely he will be able to return to his apartment, but the prognosis is guarded. So if we will please hold him and Jennifer and her family in your thoughts and prayers at this time of uncertainty and anxiety. And we thought to be ministerial to our minister, it would be a good thing for us to create space and an opportunity for her to do what she needs to do with her family without having to be concerned about this morning's service. So, you get me instead. UU Cafe at... that reminds me a little bit of what, I don't know if you ever watched the Colbert, or Stephen Colbert, the evening with Stephen, but he always says his name and then pauses a little bit to wait till they applaud. I see this is totally shameless. Moving right along. UU Cafe, grade 7 and coming of age classes are serving up their famous lasagna to raise money for Share the Light, a service that provides support and holiday gifts for youth in Nassau County. So come and feed yourselves and your souls in need of at the social hall this Sunday. So that will be right after the service. The car wash, some of you may have been drawn into the car wash. Senior Seminar is washing cars to raise funds for their service learning trips to Pine Ridge Lakota Reservation in South Dakota. So you can help them by taking your car after the service. It would be good to wait till after the service to take the car, and for, I believe it's $10, you can get your car washed and do a good thing for the senior seminar. Donations are also greatly received whether or not you have your car washed. So, at 1 p.m. in the art gallery, the town hall will be focused on ministerial transition in our future. That's 1 o'clock in the art gallery. Next week, the service will focus on General Assembly 2018, a little retrospective. All Are Called is the title, and you'll be hearing some interesting reflections from persons who were there. Please look at the other announcements in your order of service. Finally, we welcome any of you who are new to our congregation today. We are joyful to receive you and hope that you may stay for this lasagna lunch and to talk with one another and talk with other members of our congregation. It is our custom at this point to greet one another warmly, and we invite you to do so at this time.
The reading is from Joyce Atkinson. The womb of stars embrace us. Remnants of their fiery furnace is pulse through our veins. We are of the stars. The dust of the explosions cast across space. We are of the earth. We breathe and live in the breath of the ancient plants and beasts. Their cells nourish the soil. We build our communities on their harvest of gifts. Our fingers trace the curved clade, carved in stone by forebearers unknown to us. As we light our chalice, let us remind ourselves that we are a part of a great circle of humanity, gathered around the fires, the hearth, the altar. We gather anew this day to celebrate our common heritage. May we recall in gratitude all that has given us birth. Now please rise in body and spirit as we sing together hymn number 331. Life is the greatest gift of all.
For the words and song of affirmation printed in your order of service. Love is the doctrine of this congregation. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need. This do we affirm and covenant with each other.
Our anthem this morning, How Can I Keep From Singing? And we're indebted to Herb Waldron, who will bring his talents once again to bear on this anthem. And really enjoyed hearing that prelude, Herb. Thank you.
Thank you, Herb.
let there be an offering to sustain and strengthen this place, which is sacred to many of us, a community of memory and of hope, for which we are now the keeper of the dream. Will the ushers please come forward?
Please stand in body or spirit and join me in responsive reading number 650 in the gray hymnal. That's number 650. Cherish your doubts, for doubt is the attendance of truth.
Doubt is the key to the door of knowledge. It is the servant of discovery.
A belief which may not be questioned binds us to error, for there is incompleteness and imperfection in every belief.
Doubt is the touchstone of truth. It is an acid which eats away the false.
Let no one fear the truth, that doubt may consume it, for doubt is a testing of belief.
The truth stands boldly and unafraid. It is not shaken by the testing.
For truth, if it be truth, arises from each testing stronger, more secure.
Those that would silence doubt are filled with fear. Their houses are built on shifting sands.
But those who fear not doubt and know its use are founded on rock.
They shall walk in the light of growing knowledge. The work of their hands shall endure.
Therefore, let us not fear doubt, but let us rejoice in its help.
It is to the wise as a staff to the blind. Doubt is the attendant of truth.
This is the time for the lighting of candles, of joy, of concerns, of expectations, hope, or grief. If whatever is in your heart, you may come forward, either candle boxes.
we join in a moment of meditation and prayer. In the spirit of Joseph Priestley, we give you thanks, O God, for the majesty of earth and our place in the interdependent web of life. We give you thanks for children whose questions continually spur us to look at the glorious earth with new eyes, and whose concerns inspire us to protect and preserve this amazing, majestic planet. Save us from indifference to our children's insights. Grant us a growing collective wisdom to keep hope alive for them as we work to renew ourselves and our world. We give you thanks for wonder and awe, for that speechlessness we sometimes experience when we look up into the star-filled sky or into another's eyes. Save us from the death of wonder, and grant us that humility which prevents us from claiming powers we do not have, thereby compelling us to join with others in action for the common good. We give you thanks for open minds. Save us from parochial thinking. Keep us ever mindful of those who cannot articulate their interests in the face of powers and principalities, especially the poor, the imprisoned, the intimidated, the ignored, the exploited, the broken. May we count ourselves among those who are helping them find a voice and a receptive listening audience. And finally, we give you thanks for discoveries made through science and inventions devised through technology. Help us ensure that the benefits of science and technology are equitably shared on this small planet. Grant us larger hearts and bolder imaginations that we might utilize discoveries and inventions for the benefit of all of Earth's people and all of Earth's creatures. So may it always be. Shalom. Amen. In solidarity with our cohorts in the Southern Hemisphere, our soloist this morning, Michael St. Peter, our new tenor soloist, and let us welcome him mightily. So in solidarity with him, in what is here the early part of autumn, he is going to be doing Im Frühling by Franz Schubert. Im Frühling means in springtime, and that's what's happening in the Southern Hemisphere. So.
Ist so
Thank you, Michael. We can hold that in our hearts as the days of autumn and winter come. Spring cannot be far behind. It's beautiful. Well, Unitarian Universalists have this penchant for claiming as Unitarian Universalists bunches of people who would probably roll over in their graves if they knew we were doing that. We're sort of obsessed with finding famous UUs, and sometimes I think we really reach. Today, however, we have someone we don't have to reach for. This guy belongs squarely in the Unitarian Universalist camp. Today's figure is linked with much that we take for granted today. Oxygen, which I think we'll admit is very useful. Nitrogen and other gases. The word rubber for congealed latex from Central America. The fundamentals of photosynthesis, how plants take light and do their magic. Disproof of the theory of spontaneous generation, that life springs magically out of nothing. A history of electricity, and author of the phrase, "A friend in need is a friend indeed." I am speaking of Joseph Priestley. It was a great delight to read about Priestley. I had the sense after I read about him that I would really love to have an opportunity to sit down with him for an afternoon and pick his brain, which was an extraordinarily lively mind. And he was an extraordinarily disciplined man as well, evident from the outlook of his life, both scientifically in the field of literature. His books of non-scientific writing amount to 26 volumes, and that doesn't include all of his results from the science writing as well. He was a person deeply devoted to his family, to his wife, and to his 4 children, and he lived at a pretty exciting time. England in the middle to late 1700s, and then the US from 1794 to 1804. He was a personal friend to lots of household names. Think of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and some who were not household names, but pretty well known at the time. Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Theophilus Lindsay, one of the first Unitarian ministers in England. Anton Lavoisier, French chemist. And Edmund Burke, a member of Parliament with whom Priestley had a major sparring match, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. The time in which he lived was a time of dissent in both religion and in politics. It was a time of revolution. There had been a revolution in England in the previous century. There was all the ferment in the colonies here in the 1770s. You might remember hearing about that. And in France in the 1790s. It was a time of great fear and great hope for England and France and the future of humankind. It was a time of deep thinking and very, very spirited public discussion, debate, and argumentation about the issues of the day. It was a time when enlightened thinking was, in fact, coming to full flower. Joseph Priestley was a preacher, a man of principle, and a scientist, and his first commitment was to his faith and to his vocation as a Unitarian minister. This is something that doesn't get noted so much in the historic scientific textbooks, that the researcher, the discoverer of oxygen, was actually a Unitarian minister. We like to claim some power in our past. His commitment to science grew out of his faith. Let me share with you a brief outline of his life. He was born in Yorkshire in northeast England on March 13th, 1733. Now that was a very auspicious day. March 13th is also my sister's birthday. She is, however, younger than he, and you can tell her that if you see her. His parents were strict Calvinists. His mother died fairly young and had as her last vision a vision of heaven. Her last words were, "Let me go to that fine place." So he had a lifelong connection with this image of his mother with her dying words and her image of heaven. This held a place in his heart for his Christian piety his whole life long. regardless of whatever else might have come along in his life. Faith in some kind of a place where peace and justice were realized for people and suffering was over. He regarded the Christian faith as something that existed to promote just and virtuous living. He was an independent thinker from his youth. As a 19-year-old, he rejected the notion of original sin, as I suspect some of you in this room may have done at a similar age. And he rejected the notion of God's condemning anyone eternally. He became what was known in England at the time as one of the dissenter ministers. He entered the ministry at age 22, having a marked stammer, which he had all his life. Now, Priestley had this absolutely magnificent way of seeing a silver lining in everything. And he said that the stammer was a good thing because it prevented him from being seduced by the love of popular applause as a preacher. I think that's a wonderful way of looking at things. He taught classics and literature at a private dissenting school in Warrington, which still survives as Manchester College in Oxford, which has a Unitarian bent even to this day. He did a compilation on the eminent men of all ages, and yes, I'm afraid it was men of all ages. The Enlightenment hadn't quite gotten to where it needed to get with regard to women. You'll see a lot of quotes that I will use are not gender inclusive. I thought about making them gender inclusive, but I thought, no, you can make the translation for Priestley. I don't think it represents any malice on his part. I think it just represents one of the few arenas in which he was not ahead of his time. But there weren't many. He wrote this compilation, required a lot of trips to London, and it was on these trips to London that he became a lifelong friend of Benjamin Franklin. It was Franklin, in fact, who suggested he write the history of electricity, which he did, so successfully that the Royal Society admitted him as a member when he was only 33. He left teaching to pastor a congregation near Leeds. The place where he lived was located next to a brewery. Now, this is important. It spurred his interest in fixed air, in the carbon dioxide which he saw lying over the vats in the brewery. He continued experiments with this gas by pouring acid on chalk, then dissolving it in water, and he made a kind of sparkling water, like a seltzer beverage. I could have become a quack, he said, as I'm sure he could have, by peddling this sparkling water as a medicinal substance, but he was too principled for that. Nevertheless, the Copley Society awarded him a recognition for being a sort of forerunner of the sparkling beverage industry. So we have Joseph Priestley to thank for soda. He met Lord Shelburne, a man who shared his liberal views, and Lord Shelburne invited him to become his personal librarian and literary companion, with time to do experiments. In 1774, he used burning glass to obtain a new gas from mercuric oxide, which is 5 to 6 times purer than ordinary air that we breathe. He was invited to Paris, where he shared his findings and methodology with Lavoisier, who repeated the experiments and named the new gas oxygen. Priestley's independent and unpopular theological views alienated his patron to some extent, so Priestley moved his family to Birmingham, where he led another dissenting congregation and continued his scientific experiments. In Birmingham, Priestley completed his 6-volume work on different kinds of air. I'm sure that's scintillating reading. And he wrote The History of the Corruptions of Christianity. Now, this was a work critical of those whom he believed had corrupted the pure Christianity of Scripture, particularly with ideas from Greek philosophy. This was not a popular work within the Church of England, or with the establishment, or even with other dissenting churches. Not only that, but he also championed the American colonists, the French Revolution, and he got into a major political row with Edmund Burke, a member of the House of Commons, who vigorously opposed toleration of dissent or support of the revolutionary movement in France. Burke viciously vilified Priestley on the floor of the House of Commons, So much so that public sentiment was very strongly raised against Priestley. And here are the consequences of that sort of public sentiment gone awry. On the second anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, July 14th, 1791, a mob in Birmingham attacked Priestley's house, burned it down, burned his library and all his papers. Priestley and his family barely escaped with their lives. He went to London, where he spent 3 unhappy years and where vilification from Burke continued. Finally, in April 1794, he and his wife boarded a ship bound for the United States. Their 3 sons had already gone there seeking work. They arrived in New York City after a voyage of 2 months. It's a lot quicker to fly, where they were warmly greeted by the scientific community and public officials in New York, but a lot less warmly by church folks in this country, as you might expect. To accommodate his ailing wife's wishes, they located in rural Northumberland, Pennsylvania, where a house that he built still stands as a museum. He continued to preach and, in fact, encouraged lay leaders to establish a new society of Unitarian Christians in Philadelphia, which became the first explicitly named Unitarian church in the United States. He also did scientific experiments and continued to present papers. Then his youngest son, Henry, died, and just before the new house was to be finished, his wife died, and he was crushed. He continued correspondence with Jefferson, Adams, and Rush, but he fell ill and died in February of 1804. After telling his grandchildren the night before to continue to love each other, and then dictating revisions to 3 pamphlets and uttering when he heard the corrections read back to him, "That's right, I now have done." After Priestley's death, John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson of Priestley saying, "This great and extraordinary man, whom I sincerely loved and respected, was really a phenomenon, a comet in the system, a comet in the system." I'd like to share with you just a few of the insights as preacher, scientist, and man of principles that led Adams to this assessment. This is wisdom taken from some of the 26 volumes of his non-scientific writings, collated by John Ruskin Clark, minister at First Unitarian Church of San Diego in the mid-20th century. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but there's some wonderful ideas and thoughts that I want to share with you. First, on the relationship between science and religion, which was something that we talked about at our discussion on Thursday under UU Humanism. Ministry, as I've mentioned, was his primary vocation, and science was an avocation. Science was the way of finding answers for him to the theological questions about the processes of creation. And Priestley thought to free Christianity from these corruptions which prevent its reception with philosophical and thinking persons. He was an advocate and a practitioner of close and careful observation of the world. He knew that science could keep us humble. Here is what he said: "Such is the necessary condition of all things in the system of nature, that every discovery brings to our view many things of which we had no intimation before. The greater is the circle of light, the greater is the boundary of darkness in which it is confined. In time, the bounds of light will still be further extended, and from the infinity of the divine nature and the divine works, we may promise ourselves an endless progress in our investigations of them, a prospect truly sublime and glorious." Joseph Priestley was a cockeyed optimist. On education, he believed, and keep in mind this is the early decades of the 19th century, he believed that education was the chief engine of positive change and reform. He encouraged educators to have children draw upon their own experiences. He encouraged them to create opportunities for children to succeed because he felt they learned better from succeeding than from failing. He urged the harnessing of children's feelings in the process of education, not just their rational thinking. He was a very strong advocate of liberty in education and advocated a variety of different approaches. He said the excellence of human nature consists of the variety of which it is capable. Instead, then, of endeavoring by uniform and fixed systems of education to keep mankind always the same, let us give free scope in everything which may bid fair for introducing more variety among us. And how about truth? He was an early recognizer of the role that prejudice plays in impeding our own access to truth. He noted how slow he was in his own observations and experiments to change his own mind about what was going on. He attributed this to the force of prejudice, which, unknown to ourselves, biases not only our judgments, but even the perceptions of our senses. We may take a maxim so strongly for granted that the plainest evidence of sense will not entirely change and often hardly modify our persuasions. This, of course, does not apply to anybody in this particular room. One of my favorite observations of his is about truth and immortality, the consequences of us getting set in our ways as we get older, which is something that I'm thinking about more and more these days. And he wrote, "It is a happy cause of truths, as well as other valuable purposes, that man is mortal. For otherwise, the species would soon arrive at its maximum in all improvement, as individuals now do." A little tongue-in-cheek. Good observation. Now here's an even more interesting way of looking at the world. He had an eye for the systems that make it up, and he saw a divine providence at work in creation. We are part of a system that is, in his view, the best of all possible worlds, even the realities of evil and suffering. And here's what he said: "It should be a rule with us, when we are considering any particular thing in the system of nature, to take in everything that is necessarily connected with it, so that, on the whole, we should gain more than we should lose. We must pronounce the thing complained of to be beneficial to us and should thankfully bear the evil for the sake of the greater good that accompanies it. Fire, for instance, is the occasion for a great deal of mischief and distress in the world," and this was at a time when whole cities would burn down, "but it is not to be compared with the benefits that we derive from the use of that element." He was both an optimist and a person who saw a kind of benign and beneficent order in the universe. And finally, interdependence. And I was delighted to find in his work an affirmation of our theme for this year, the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. He had a growing awareness, even at that time, of the interdependence of the world. Here's a quote that sounds as though it could be written today. "These connections of man with man, humanity with humanity, are every day growing more extensive. The most distant parts of the earth are now connected. Every part is every day growing still more necessary to every other part. And the nearer advances we make to general happiness, and the more commodious circumstances in this world are made for us, the more intimately and extensively we become connected with, and the more closely we are dependent upon one another." This interdependence was not only political and social, but also cosmic. We have this one rhapsodic passage, "The connection that all persons and all things necessarily have as parts of an immense, glorious, and happy system, and of which we ourselves are a part, however small and inconsiderable, with the great author of this system, makes us regard every person and everything in a friendly and pleasing light." Would that it were so. What a generous spirit. It is, of course, impossible to adequately sum up any life with a few words, so I conclude with two testimonials. The first from Thomas Jefferson, writing from Monticello years after Priestley's death. Here is what Jefferson wrote. Had the doctrines of Jesus always been preached as pure as they came from his lips, the whole civilized world would now have been Christian. I rejoice that in this blessed country of free inquiry and belief, which has surrendered its conscience to neither kings nor priests, the genuine doctrine of only one God is reviving, and I trust there is not a young man now living in the United States who will not die Unitarian. Prophetic words from Thomas Jefferson. And finally, Jacob Ranowski, claiming in The Ascent of Man that ascent is made possible by people who have two qualities, an immense integrity and at least a little genius. Priestley had both in abundance. So we can be proud to claim him as one of our authentic Unitarian forebears, and I pray that we may always be worthy of his legacy of trust, of curiosity, and of courage. So may it always be. Shalom, blessed be, insha'Allah, aho, shanti, amen. Please let us rise in body or spirit as we sing together hymn number 345 in the gray hymnal. With joy, we claim the growing light.
Here now are closing words from Kathleen McTee. May the light around us guide our footsteps and hold us fast to the best and most righteous that we seek. May the darkness around us nurture our dreams and give us rest so that we may give ourselves to the world, the work of our world. Let us seek to remember the wholeness of our lives, the weaving of light and shadow in this great and astonishing dance in which we move.